It's joyous to be part of a congregation that sings out, sings enthusiastically. This morning's lesson really is kind of a bookend lesson with Joe Pisano's from last week. Last week, Joe talked about hope in suffering. This morning, I'd like us to look at the idea of grace in suffering. You say, well, Paul, what do you mean by that? That is finding God's grace in seasons of suffering. And I'd like us to look at it from several standpoints. The first thing I'd like us to think about, and probably on one level we know it's so, but we get reminded of it, that suffering is universal and varied. If you look at Job, and we'll follow some of his experiences, some suffer financial disaster, some the death of a child or children or maybe a mate. And there were a number of individuals that I didn't mention in announcements, but this certainly is worthy of our prayers. In the bulletin, Nikki Allison's granddaughter Hannah undergoing treatment for leukemia. She's making progress, but prayers are still needed. Last night, I had called Bill Spahn, one of the elders from Sumner, talking about Marilyn Boland and how her grandson lost his life in a car accident this weekend. And I hear kids in the background, and they're hollering and whooping it up. And I said, well, you got a party going on. He said, well, let me tell you about that. My grandson is in the hospital for, I think it was lymphoma. He said, but it's a very treatable form. And so they go through that. Dale and Tammy Wanden, former members when we were in West Campus, lost their grandson. Little Ziva from Montana had multiple birth defects, early tragic illnesses, and God's healing her. So whoever leads final prayer, I want you to include them as well. But how devastating that is for families. It may be major health reversals or criticism or family abandoned or rejected them. It can be terrible decisions that they made, like David, and Nathan has to tell them the sword will never depart from your house. Well, you started an avalanche. I don't like that. Let's stop it. You can do some mitigation on avalanche work so it doesn't wipe out a bunch of skiers. But once it's started, I don't know how to stop it mid-course. But David could end up being faithful to God, regardless of the poor decisions he made earlier. Interesting passage in Romans chapter 8 and down verse 22 says the whole creation groans and suffers until now. Barnes, among others, say that everything, bugs, wildebeest, humans, everything. And so that's part of a fallen world. In 2 Corinthians 11, 23 through 27, Paul comments about the stresses in his own life, and I just chose some of them, often without sleep or hungry or cold, or the pressure on him regarding other churches that he helped establish, and he wanted them to be faithful. It might be in Luke 17 and verse 1, the spiritual heartaches. He said it's inevitable the stumbling blocks will come. Sometimes different congregations or people, and so you try to prepare. I want to be strong. In fact, I was talking to a brother in Christ. I did a rehearsal on Friday night, wedding on Saturday afternoon for a young couple, a family up in Silver Lake, actually beyond that, in Marysville area. And the father of the groom took me aside after some of the festivities have kind of quieted down, and he talked to me about his wife that is starting into early dementia and how devastating. He said, I don't know how I'll go on without her. He said, Paul, you probably feel the same way, and this is a little slice of life. I said, if there's a choice, I would rather Glenda die first because I can take care of her, not her take care of me. And so I told this brother, I said, look, The blessing is you get to take care of her. You be strong. You be the warrior, because your kids need you after that, and so does everybody else. Because you're trying to give encouragement to somebody facing difficult times. It may be marriage in ruins. Somebody leaves, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 15. Maybe a divorce, some kind of disaster there. It may be birth defects, like the son of Jonathan was lame in both feet. It may be in a person's life, regardless how spiritual minded they were, that's not the choices the children make, like Eli's sons and Samuel's sons. Man, they were the exact opposite of dad. So that actually happens. But here's the neat part, that God gives us some promises, like Proverbs chapter 3 and in verse 34, that God shows grace to the afflicted. Say, you're going to face hard times somewhere in your life experiences. He said, but God's going to be with you every minute of that time. James 4, 6 and following, he gives us more grace. I tell you what, if somebody say, you need help, man, I always need help. Whatever it is, I could use some more help. And in fact, Joe and Laura said, Paul, look, would like to lighten some of your load. What can we do for you? And Laura said to me this morning, she said, you didn't call this weekend. I said, I got moles. Would you like that? And so we'll get that solved. But the reality is, here's Christians willing to help Christians. God said, I care about you. I want to make it better in your life, regardless of what you face. In Hebrews 13 and verse 5, he says, I will never desert you, which is so encouraging. He said the same thing to his people in the Old Testament, Deuteronomy 31, 6 through 8. Beautiful passage by David is Psalm 56, 8. Put my tears in thy bottle. Are they not in thy book? God, you know how heartbroken I am. And I want you to take note of that. And that's one of the things we think about, because sometimes tragedy and heartache makes us feel isolated. Joel says, the Lord is compassionate and gracious. Sometimes people feel like God's an angry God, and he's willing to, man, he's looking out for Vince, and he's got a shovel, and I'm whack him first time I can. That's not how God is. God said, I really care about you. I want the best for you. How can I help you? And as people go through life, there's stages and elements to suffering. And that's where I'm going to take some of Job's life and say, oh yeah, well he was here at this time or at that time. And how about you? What difficult times have you gone through? As we start out in Job chapter 1 and verse 1, really it was a neat guy. He was blameless, the text says, upright, feared God, and turned away from evil. He was really on track and on target, and we appreciate that from him. Beside that, this guy was one wealthy dude. In 1:3, talks about the enormity of his assets. 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 1,000 oxen. One of the greatest men, the cattlemen of the East. Wow, just tremendously wealthy. And spiritual. We appreciate that from Job 1:5. How he continually offered burnt offerings for his children, lest they had cursed God in their hearts. Parents, you already pray for your kids. You've been doing it since they're little. You do it when they're big. You always pray for them. And you want the very best for them. And that's the kind of guy this guy was. And yet, tragic things happen to good people. It was Satan's idea in Job 1 and verse 11. And aside from that, sometimes people feel just crushed by circumstances. Well, God, if you really love me, then why is all this happening? In Psalm 73, verses 13 through 19, the writer there, Asaph, begins to question God. He said, maybe I've washed my hands in innocence. And it's for nothing. I'm trying to be good, and the bad people seem like they're getting better. And he said, if I would have spoken thus, if I'd have started telling others, hey, here's how Ken, here's how I feel about that. I'm all beaten down. He said, I would have betrayed the sons of thy children, because when I considered their latter end, wow, the end of life things maybe don't look so happy as the middle of life. And that the tragedy faces them ultimately and eternally. So Job was an outstanding guy, but as you know, he faced difficult things. And for him, tragedy after tragedy strike. I mean, one, being run over by a train, but as soon as you get up, the next train hits you, and you catch on fire. Wow. Ecclesiastes 9:11 says, time and chance. You know, the race isn't to the swift or battle to the strong. Just because you think, I've got it all together, I've got life planned out, it's going to be good, and I guarantee. No guarantees in life. You lose children, you lose health. There's tragedies, and they're real. And Solomon said, time and chance overtake them all. And we'd see Job's story. Why does God have it there? Because it helps us when we face tragedy. Here's what we went through. We say, man, how can anybody stand it? Then we look at what Job went through and say, wow. It gives us courage. And kind of looking at the end from the beginning, Job was never told why that happened to him. But he went through it, went through his own upheaval internally, and came out amazing. And he has encouraged us for 3,000 years. So sometimes, some of the reversals is going to be so devastating to you, and somehow it's going to work out to inspire somebody else that has their own losses. So 1,000 of his oxen are stolen, Job 1:15. And the Sabaeans did it and killed the servants for them. 7,000 sheep in verse 16. Plus the servants were killed by lightning. It says fire from heaven, at least the commentators say it's lightning. Pulpit and JFB and Bible Knowledge Commentary and such. 3,000 camels are stolen, and the Chaldeans took them and slayed the serpent. So what you're finding out is one massive tragedy after the other. And he got 10 children. He'd been sacrificing for, and all 10 are dead. I mean, how do you handle that? To me, it's bewildering. I can't wrap my mind around that. It says a wind, and so various commentators say that likely a tornado. And so what do we learn from this? Well, sometimes when disaster strikes, it doesn't stop with one crushing blow. It may be a chronic illness, and we find that in Job chapter 2 and in verse 7. He had boils from top of his head down to his feet. And years ago, I don't know how, Paul Mitchell and I talked about that one time, and that I had one boil. How was it? Man, that was miserable. One. He had them all over the place. And Mayo Clinic says it's a skin infection caused by Staphylococcus bacteria. It can enter the bloodstream, and if it does, it can cause blood poisoning, sepsis, and it can affect the heart and the bone. So it's a massive thing, not just uncomfortable. And it can be contagious by skin-to-skin contact or by touching contaminated objects. Pain is lessened by incision and letting the boil drain. Guess what he's doing? He's sitting in a pile of ashes, taking pottery to try to lance the boils. And so he's sitting in the ashes. You can't be around family. It just shows his massive grief. And then Mrs. Job. Why don't you just curse God and die? We think, what kind of loser thing is that? Wait a minute. She went through the same thing as he did. She lost everything he did. So it's her devastation. And he has his own. So then you have, beside the physical effects, then you have the conflicting emotions that wash over you. Job 1:20, Job tore his robe and shaved his head and said, naked came I from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Paul, that'd be you, right? I just pictured myself unconscious. How in the world? But he did. And that shows me, Paul, you could. Job 3, 1 and following. Then Job begins not cursing God, but looks at his own life. And he cursed the day he was born. Why did I not die at birth? Why did I have to be born to go through all this? And then 3:20 and following. Why is the light that is of day given to him who suffers, and life to the bitter of soul, who long for death, and there is none? He said, I wish I could just die. And you're not. You go through the tragedy. Job 3:25, what I fear comes upon me. Look for peace, and turmoil comes. That's why some folks suicide. They wrongly feel they're out of options, and they're tired of the pain. Wow. And so suffering is real, and there's stages to it. You get hit by the initial crushing blow. You begin to just be shredded by your own emotions. And then friends come to help, right? Yeah, Job's friends, Eliphaz. So they see what terrible condition, and then they sit down for a week and stare at him. Man, I tell you what, that'd make me happy. What in the world? Eliphaz. Then he wants to kind of, I'll say, cheer him up. He's going to give, a lot of times you go through suffering and people are going to give friendly advice, and you go, oh, what clunk. Eliphaz said, you admonished and helped and strengthened many. And then 4:5, it touches you and you are impatient. Impatient. I'm going to knock your head off. Job lost absolutely everything. And you're saying, I'm impatient? You have no idea how impatient I am. In 4:8, he said, Eliphaz said, what I have seen, that those who sow trouble harvested. All right. We're going to check you out, Hester. I mean, you're up here, you're helping us out, and you'll song lead, and you give devotions, but man, reality, you've been stealing cars lately. What do you got going on the side you're not telling? Because obviously, Job, you couldn't be going through this stuff if you didn't have something going wrong. And so then he just becomes really bold about it, 22:5. He said, your wickedness is great and your iniquity is without end. How do I know that? Look how bad a condition you are in. That tells you, you're a rotten sinner. This was the friend that came to cheer him up. And Zophar, his buddy, in 11:14 says, if iniquity is in your hand, put it away. You know, it's just, I'm not going to be as severe as Eliphaz was, but hey, bud, you know, something's going wrong here. And Job says, 12:2, you are the people, and wisdom will die with you. I mean, I've never heard such great insight. And when you guys die, nobody's going to know anything because you're as smart as they come. In 16:2, he says, sorry, comforters are you all. Man, if you are here to be an encouragement, you are miserable. You just didn't make it work at all. And people do that. Well, how do you handle that part? Ecclesiastes 7:21, Solomon says, do not take seriously all the words that are spoken against you. People will say things, mean well, and they just don't know any better. And so you say, well, imagine that, and let it roll on off if you can. But still, within the person, doubts will rise. And Job 9:16 said, if I called, that is on God, I couldn't believe he was listening to my voice. I feel too isolated from God, too far away. In 9:18, he will not allow me to catch my breath. He saturates me with bitterness. Look, 24, if not he, who? So you can see he's wrestling this. God didn't bring it, Satan did, and he's trying to sort out all the catastrophe in his life. And he said, but if God didn't do it, then who did? So he's trying to think the situation through. But you're just being crushed by the circumstances. Job 9:14, he said, my relatives have failed. My intimate friends have forgotten me. So sometimes you're just isolated. And in 1917, I'm repulsive to my wife, loathsome to my brothers. Man, what a load to carry. 1920, my bone clings to my skin, And this phrase we use, I've escaped by the skin of my teeth, means the slightest, most narrowest margin possible. It is said, the skin of your teeth, when you brush your teeth, that little bit of tartar, he said, that's a little bit I had just between me and death. And the reality is, as he comes through this, ultimately, and what we get out of it is with all that tragedy, his faith shines brightly. In 13:15, he says, though he slay me, I will trust him. If he takes my life, okay, it's all good. One of our members died earlier this spring, Omar Byers, and as cancer took its toll on him, I'd go by to see him, and I shared this with the group. And he's just, like Job says, skin and bones. I said, Omar, how are you doing today? And he always said, it's all good. I said, Paul, I don't care what you face. If he faces that, I can say it's all good every time, including the day before he died. And he couldn't even move except his lips. And I said, Omar, how are you doing today? And he said, it's all good. I go, man, that is so inspirational. In Job 19:25, he said, I know my Redeemer lives, and he will take his stand on the earth, the coming Christ. He said, I believe it. I'm sold out. I'm 100% dedicated. 19:26, and after my skin is flayed from my flesh. He said, man, I got not only skin with a bunch of bulls, I don't even have skin anymore. Yet from my flesh I shall see God. Man, what a hero in the faith. How inspirational. And 40 in verse 2 and 3, in exchange with God, he says, I know that you can do all things, and I have declared that which I did not understand, things too wonderful for me. God, I really don't know how you rule the universe, but I'm saying, God, if it was me, here's how, don't we do that? God, I got it planned. I want it to be A instead of B, but you had it this other way, and because really, obviously, I know how it all works, right? Paul, I know you don't know how hardly anything works. And he comes to confront his own shortcomings in understanding how the universe really ticks. And so, well, what do we do about that? Well, we think about God's sustaining grace. And so how do we display those spectacular attitudes that they have? Well, number one is you internalize the very things that he and the Bible characters say. Isaiah 43 and in verse 2, when you pass through the waters, I will be with you. When you walk through the fire, you'll not be scorched. Man, as Vince was talking about, here's the floods. He said, man, I'm going to come through the floods. I will come through the fires. I am created to come through whatever there is. Psalm 34 and in verse 19, many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord will deliver him out of them all. And think about this. He delivers his children sometimes from death and sometimes by death. God delivers. Psalm 73 and verse 26, he said, my flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. Man, I'm bolted in place. I want to stay. I want to be that warrior that God wants me to be regardless of the experiences and reversals in life, because Romans 8:28, all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. I wondered why I was such a messed up kid at 12. And then my dad died when I was 15 and things went over the edge. It took me a long time to come to terms with that. And I thought, Paul, had he not died, you would have ended up just like him, because that's the direction you were going. And God said, Paul, you're not going the right way yet. And your parents aren't going to go that way. I'm going to point you in a new direction, and you have no clue what's in store yet. but I'm going to take you out of this difficult environment, and I want to make you a child of the King. You go, wow. Well, Paul, you understood that at 13, right? Oh, no. Decades later, looking back, say, here was a good element that came out of all that heartache. So how do you display the spectacular attitudes? Well, there's action that you take. In Psalm 119, verse 50, he said, my comfort in affliction is that thy word has revived me. That is, those promises that you made, strengthen me. I can do it. And various passages, one of them, Revelation chapter 10, verse 9, the strong angel says, John is told, take the book from the hand of the strong angel and eat it. You ingest it. It's not, well, I just kind of sit here and I heard some pleasant passages. They mean something to me. I'm going to write them down. It's going to become part of my life, and I want to share that with others. Ecclesiastes 3:1 and following, there's a time for everything, and there's a time to weep. I mentioned that I don't cry a lot. I hurt very deeply, but that's not how I express it. But it's honorable to do so. John 11:35, Jesus did. James 5 and verse 3, anyone suffering, let him pray. You know, probably when we're going through those heavy times, we pray more fervently than any other time. Proverbs 11 and verse 4, in the abundance of counselors there's victory. Talking to somebody else that's been through it, that has that insight. Say, okay, that's how you do it. I'm going to work on that for my life. 1 Peter 5 and verse 7, casting all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. God knows what we're going through and really cares about us, that we have to face that. Luke 22:32, I have prayed, Jesus says to Peter, that your faith does not fail. Then, when you return, strengthen your brothers. You have experience that others don't, and they need your insight. Why? Because they're going to face their own trials. And when they do, they need that help. So, okay, I'm going to take a breath and I'm going to put one foot in front of another. And I've mentioned this many times in 1 Kings 19, verse 13 and following. Here was Elijah running from Jezebel, gets down into Horeb and is hiding in a cave. And God says, what are you doing here? Just, well, yeah, but Jezebel and all these things and the prophets, and I'm the last one. He said, no, you're not. Even if all this tragedy happens, I have 7,000 that have not bowed the knee to Baal. He said, what you need to do is get busy. You need to go up and anoint Hazael, king of Syria. You need to anoint Jehu, king over Israel, and Elisha as prophet in your place. You got a job to do. And once we see that there is a mission for us beyond our own pain, it gives us the next steps to take. So what's the end result of all of that? Ignatius, one of those guys that I think he was not only ended up as an elder in Asia Minor, that he was a disciple, I think, of Polycarp, a disciple of John, that he's finally arrested, he implores Christians not to deliver him from the Romans. He said, if you do, I'm just going to have to face it all over again. I might as well just face it and get it over with. He said, I am the wheat of Christ. I am going to be ground by the teeth of lions, that I might be found to be purebred. Goosebumps. How do you do that? Well, God is glorified. 2 Corinthians 12, 7 through 10, God tells Paul, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. 1 Peter 5:10, how we are strengthened. He said, after you have suffered a little while, the God of all grace himself will perfect, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. You go through your own disasters, and you're stronger, better, wiser, and more broken and more healed than you were before. And Christians are closer. In 1 Corinthians 12:26, if one suffers, all suffer with it. Why? Because we're a family. And you matter. And what happens to you matters and happens to all of us. And reality, it has an impact for generations. Daniel 12 and verse 3, and those who have insight will shine brightly like the brightness of the expanse of heaven. And those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. So as we think about that kind of thing, here's what we've learned. What we've seen is that suffering is universal and varied. The whole creation suffers. God promises grace to the afflicted. And there's stages of it. Disaster stuns, pressure increases, emotions up, emotions down. Friends may criticize, doubts personally may arise, but your faith will ultimately be victorious. And so how do you overcome? You internalize those promises that God has made. You fulfill your mission, and the end result, God is glorified. You are stronger, Christians are closer, and generations are impacted. God's grace in suffering. We are more than conquerors. We're going to sing this song, and some of you may know it, others not. We're going to sing it enthusiastically, and whether you'd like prayers or want to be baptized, however we can help, we'd be honored to do so. Vince, why don't you come and lead our minds in this song? They'll know that we are Christians.